The Sistine Chapel is probably the single most recognizable room in the entire Catholic Church, appearing constantly throughout this channel simply because it's where conclaves actually happen. But the building itself, and especially its famous ceiling, has a genuinely fascinating origin story of its own. One involving a pope with a specific vision for the room, a sculptor who considered himself entirely unsuited for the job he was being pressured into, and a 4-year physical ordeal that nearly broke the artist involved. This video is about how the Sistine Chapel actually came to look the way it does. Welcome to Pope Pulse. This continues our deep dive into Catholic Church history. Let's start with the building itself, before we even get to the ceiling everyone recognizes. The Sistine Chapel takes its name from Pope Sixtus IV, who commissioned its construction in the early 1470s. Sixtus wanted a dedicated chapel specifically for the Pope's own household and for major papal ceremonies, built on the site of an older, structurally weaker medieval chapel that had fallen into disrepair by that point. Construction was completed relatively quickly, finishing around 1481 or 1482, and the chapel's proportions were reportedly designed with a deliberate, symbolic reference in mind, dimensions echoing the traditional measurements described for the Temple of Solomon in the Old Testament, deliberately connecting this new papal chapel to that much older, biblically significant structure. The chapel's walls were initially decorated by several of the most significant painters working in Italy at the time, including Sandro Botticelli, Domenico Ghirlandaio, and Pietro Perugino, among others, producing a series of frescoes depicting parallel scenes from the lives of Moses and Christ along the two side walls. For roughly 3 decades following its completion, this original wall decoration was actually the chapel's primary claim to artistic fame. The ceiling most people picture today when they hear Sistine Chapel didn't yet exist in anything like its eventual, famous form. That changed with Pope Julius II, who became pope in 1503 and quickly developed a reputation as an unusually ambitious patron of major artistic and architectural projects across Rome, including the massive, decades-long rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica itself, which we've touched on in an earlier video in this series. Julius decided the Sistine Chapel's original ceiling, a relatively simple painted blue surface decorated with gold stars, needed a considerably more ambitious replacement, befitting the broader artistic transformation he envisioned for the Vatican more generally during his pontificate. For this specific project, he wanted Michelangelo Buonarroti, already a celebrated sculptor following works including his famous statue of David, completed a few years earlier in Florence. There was just one significant problem. Michelangelo, by his own account and by the account of several contemporaries, considered himself first and foremost a sculptor, not a painter, and was genuinely reluctant to take on a massive fresco painting commission, particularly one of this scale and technical difficulty, involving techniques he had comparatively limited direct experience with compared to sculpture, his primary and preferred medium. According to multiple historical accounts, Michelangelo actively attempted to avoid the specific commission, reportedly even suggesting that the job be given instead to Raphael, another major artist working in Rome during this same period, whom Michelangelo apparently believed was better suited to a large-scale painting project of this kind. Some historical accounts also suggest genuine professional rivalry and suspicion played a role in Michelangelo's reluctance. A belief, whether entirely accurate or not, that certain rivals within Rome's competitive artistic community had specifically pushed for Michelangelo to receive this commission precisely because they expected him to struggle with, or even fail at, a large fresco project outside his primary expertise, potentially damaging his broader reputation in the process. Ultimately, though, Pope Julius II was not a patron easily refused. Julius insisted, and Michelangelo, after failing to successfully redirect the commission elsewhere, eventually agreed to take on the project himself, beginning work around 1508. What followed was one of the most demanding and, according to Michelangelo's own later accounts and correspondence, physically punishing artistic undertakings in his entire career. Painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel required Michelangelo to work for extended periods on elevated scaffolding, in a physically demanding position, applying paint to wet plaster using the fresco technique, which requires the artist to work relatively quickly on each freshly applied section before the plaster fully dries. Michelangelo's own letters and later biographical accounts from contemporaries describe genuinely significant physical strain from this sustained, awkward working position over an extended period, persistent neck and back pain, eye strain from paint frequently dripping downward onto his face and eyes during the extended hours spent working directly overhead, and general physical exhaustion that he referenced repeatedly in his own personal correspondence throughout the project. The project also faced repeated funding and scheduling tensions with Julius, who was reportedly impatient for faster progress at multiple points, leading to documented friction between the demanding, famously difficult pope and an artist who was, by most contemporary accounts, similarly strong-willed and difficult to pressure once he'd committed to his own creative vision for how the work should actually proceed. Despite these tensions, and despite the genuine physical toll described in his own letters, Michelangelo completed the ceiling in 1512, roughly 4 years after beginning the project. A genuinely fast turnaround given the ceiling's enormous scale and technical complexity, even though it likely felt considerably longer to Michelangelo himself throughout the process. The finished ceiling presents an enormously ambitious visual program, centered around 9 main scenes depicting stories from the biblical book of Genesis, running down the center of the ceiling's length. These include the famous depiction of the creation of Adam, showing God and Adam reaching toward each other with nearly touching fingers, which has become one of the single most reproduced and recognized images in the entire history of Western art, regardless of religious affiliation. Surrounding these central scenes, Michelangelo incorporated numerous additional figures, including a series of prophets and sibyls, along with dozens of individual figures generally referred to as ignudi, nude male figures whose specific symbolic meaning within the overall program continues to be debated among art historians, generally understood as serving primarily decorative and compositional purposes framing the central biblical narrative scenes. The overall composition represents a genuinely massive undertaking in terms of raw scale alone, covering the entire extended ceiling surface with dozens of individual figures, and it's generally regarded by art historians as one of the most significant single achievements in the entire history of Western Renaissance art, combining Michelangelo's deep training in sculptural anatomy and human form with an ambitious, unified theological and visual program spanning the ceiling's full length. The ceiling wasn't Michelangelo's only major contribution to the Sistine Chapel. Decades later, in the 1530s, he returned to the chapel at a considerably more advanced age to paint an enormous fresco of the Last Judgment across the chapel's altar wall, commissioned this time by Pope Clement VII and completed under Clement's eventual successor, Pope Paul III, in 1541. This later work presents a considerably darker, more turbulent visual tone compared to the ceiling completed decades earlier, generally interpreted by art historians as reflecting both Michelangelo's own personal artistic evolution over the intervening decades and the genuinely turbulent broader religious and political climate in Europe during this specific period, which included the early upheaval of the Protestant Reformation and the deeply traumatic 1527 sack of Rome, an event we've referenced elsewhere in this series, which occurred in the years between the two projects. Together, the ceiling and the later Last Judgment fresco make the Sistine Chapel home to 2 of Michelangelo's most significant individual artistic achievements, created decades apart by the same artist within the very same physical space. A genuinely unusual concentration of major artistic achievement within one single room, by any measure. So the next time you see footage or images of the Sistine Chapel in our coverage of papal conclaves, remember there's this whole additional layer of history behind the room itself. A reluctant sculptor pressured into an enormous, unfamiliar painting project by an insistent pope for years of genuine physical strain, and a finished result now considered among the single greatest individual artistic achievements in the entire history of Western art. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Catholic Church history and art, subscribe to Pope Pulse for more, and let me know in the comments, had you known Michelangelo originally didn't want this commission at all?